Great, thank you very much. And for those of you who were expecting to hear Lola Weber, apologies, you're stuck with me for the next 20 minutes. Lola sends her apologies. She was unable to attend, so I hope I can do this campaign justice because she has really been the driving force behind this for Humane Society International, and so we're just really proud to share some of the progress and where we're at in Korea. I know that for many of you that have been at the conference the last few days, there's been quite a few talks on the dog meat trade, and so you might be getting a bit dog meat trade fatigue. But hopefully this will be inspirational because there's such positive change, and we know that this is an example of where the end of this trade is truly coming to an end. So I think as opposed to other countries where we have active campaigns in Asia, there is real time for celebration here. I'm having some trouble advancing these. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Sorry about that. So just a quick outline of what we're going to be talking about, and it's going to be hard, I think, to cover all of this in 20 minutes, but I wanted to give a very top-line overview of the dog meat trade in Korea and why it is so unique as compared with other places in Asia. Talk a little bit about motivations for consumers, motivations for the traders, talk a little bit about our campaign strategy at Humane Society International and how we work to tackle this trade, and then share with you some exciting progress and developments that we've seen as recent as yesterday, actually. So a little bit about the dog meat trade in Indonesia. It's a bit different, whereas in other places it is more stolen pets or stolen street dogs. In Korea, these are truly farm dogs. So the dogs that end up in this trade are dogs that are either farmed on site on these large-scale farms, or they're also pets that people just don't want. So we see a lot of different types of dogs on these farms, and we think that, at any given time, there's up to 1 million dogs that are sitting on these farms throughout South Korea. So it's pretty shocking in terms of the numbers. There are an estimated 3,000 restaurants that are serving dog meat. A lot of these farms will have slaughtering facilities on site, but then there's also some facilities that just slaughter dogs separately. A lot of these dogs are coupled up, so they're in breeding pairs. So there's very active breeding of dogs on these farms. And as you can imagine, these dogs lead a pretty miserable existence. They are in very barren environments that are covered in feces. They are, emotionally traumatized. For them, people do not represent a good thing. And so they are also subject to the environmental extremes in Korea. So Korea has very cold winters, and so a lot of the dogs will die on these farms also. Over the winter, very little to no veterinary care. There is some indiscriminate use of antibiotics, but generally speaking, these dogs are suffering from a lot of different infections, and the method that these dogs generally are slaughtered is electrocution, and so you can imagine that's also quite traumatic. The farms vary in size. Some have less than 50 dogs, some have upwards of 1,000 dogs, so these can be very large-scale facilities. And it can be interesting because some of them are also grouped in certain communities. So you'll be on a dog meat farm and then you'll hear barking in the distance. That's another dog meat farm. And then there's another farm. So in terms of why people are eating dog meat, first and foremost, dog meat is not part of mainstream Korean culture. It is not. It is activity that is done by a very small percentage of the population, and it is generally seasonal in nature. So 70% of dog meat consumption in Korea is linked to the bulk days, which are the hottest days of the year that normally take place between kind of July and August. And it's believed that dog meat, in particular, there's a stew that's made from dog meat, will help cool the body, provide more stamina to kind of have that extra energy to kind of survive the hot days of the Korean summer. But what's really interesting is the popularity of dog meat is truly declining across Korea as we're seeing more and more pet ownership. There actually isn't a very long-standing history of dog farming in Korea. We think it only really started in the 1960s, and it is drastically decreasing in popularity as pet ownership really is booming throughout Korea. There is this misconception that is very promulgated by the dog meat industry, and I do use the word industry because unlike places like in Vietnam, Cambodia, where it's a little bit smaller scale, we do actually see an industry in terms of the dog farmers themselves are quite organized. And so I don't want to say they're unionized, but similar in nature, actually. And they do have they can be quite vocal at a political level. And so we see this kind of dual perception being propagated by those in the industry saying, but these are dog meat dogs. Like, these dog meat dogs are not the same as pet dogs, two different dogs, right? So we have here Jindos and a Tosa dog. These are very commonly found on dog farms in Korea. But then we have these pet dogs, and this is very common at these dog farms where you have a mix, like cage to cage, even within the cages of, so-called pet dogs or side by side with the meat type dog breeds. And so this is very much not true. We know that, in fact, a dog is a dog, and many of these meat dogs can be amazing, loving pets in home environments. In terms of where the dog meat trade kind of falls legislatively speaking, it is very much in a legislative limbo. It is not illegal, it's not legal, and even according to different ministries, the dog meat farms and trades and those practices are either legal or illegal depending on which ministry you're talking to. So even within MAFRA, which is the Ministry of Agriculture, they do have dogs classified as livestock, but they really should be protected. Korea does have an Animal Protection Act, which is, however, quite weak. And while we see amendments being made to this frequently, and we do see the APA, the Animal Protection Act, calling out inhumane slaughter, particularly by means of electrocution, which clearly should be enforced in these cases, it is not. It's rarely enforced, and so most of this just goes unpunished and unnoticed. So how to tackle this trade? Again, a trade that affects 1 million dogs a year, upwards of probably 1,500 farms across the country. Well, what we really try to do, first and foremost, is kind of expose what these farms actually look like, right? Because they are kept hidden and a lot of members of the Korean public aren't even aware of what these farms look like, we try to really highlight the practices. And I think it's interesting in Korea, too, there is this disparity being Korea very technologically advanced and very focused on health and welfare and beauty, but yet you have these pretty horrific facilities in the background. And so we really try to, bring influencers, bring members of the National Assembly, bring members of the government to these farms, particularly as we're closing them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that in Korea. Really highlighting, again, the animal cruelty, the public health risks that these farms pose, show that a dog is a dog, that these dogs are not just meat dogs, these dogs can be pet dogs. So trying to really dispel that dichotomy. And we want to work within the industry, not against it. Because at the end of the day, we can all argue and point fingers, but we know that many of the farmers don't want to be doing this at the end of the day. And I think that was really interesting when HSI started to get involved and was speaking with individual farmers. Most feel a sense of social shame from their families, shame from their children who don't want them to be killing and raising dogs anymore, shame even from their wives that don't want this in their backyards. And so they're really keen to actually get out of the trade. And so it made us think, well, is there a way that we can work with those in the industry and save dogs, help the people, and also show the national government that there's a model that people do want to get out of this trade, and we can try to provide an economic alternative for their livelihood. So that brought about Models for Change, and so we call this program in HSI. It is about trying to find economic models for those that are involved in the industry, and we've done so quite successfully now with 18 farms. And again, these are large farms, often of hundreds of dogs. And so how we do this is we try to work with the farmers to accomplish these kind of main goals, right? We want to expose the suffering that is present. Again, these farm closures get a lot of media attention, which can help really generate kind of public mobilization and sentiment against the trade. We want to showcase our wonderful ambassador dogs, so showcase these dogs for what they are, for the true loving companions that they are. We want to end this cycle of suffering, working, again, hand in hand with the government, hand in hand with the farmers, and then just trying to kind of create this blueprint for the government to follow. And so what does that look like? So in practice, it is quite complicated. So we have to find a farmer that is willing to change their business. And in the beginning, this was a little bit difficult, and now it's quite easy. Now we have so many farmers wanting, they want to get out of the industry because they see this as a dying industry, because there's been so much public momentum, particularly in the media and politically speaking, that farmers are like, I'm happy to get out of this. So can you help me take my dogs? And I'd like to do something else. So what that means, though, is that we have to then become responsible for all of these dogs and help the farmer find an alternative livelihood and save the dogs and close the farm, essentially. So this is what this looks like. So generally, there's a process where we sign a contract or an agreement with the farmer. We try to brainstorm with them and others that are more familiar with different livelihood transition models in Korea, what they can do. Blueberry farming. We've seen like water truck distribution as alternative livelihood options. So just as an example, this is a farm that was maybe an hour and a half outside Seoul that we closed in March, and it was really cold while we were there. And so what we do is when we identify the farm and we work with the farmer, we sign that agreement, we vaccinate all of the dogs on site, and we do a detailed inventory, because the reality is that there are very few adoptive homes for these dogs in Korea, because they are, again, there's this kind of ideology of this is a meat dog and not a pet dog, and also because Korean apartments are so small, like these are huge dogs. These Toses are massive dogs. And so we generally will adopt these out internationally, although we would absolutely love to find more local homes for these dogs. So and you can also speak with Dr. Piyush, I see here, was actually one of the rescue team members who helped with this closure. And so what we do is we'll go and we'll vaccinate all the dogs, and we'll make sure that they are fit for travel internationally. And then it is obviously we had our HSI India team on hand to help with this effort. Getting these dogs out of the cages can be quite difficult because, again, they're not accustomed to human handling. And so we will get them all loaded up. And for a lot of these dogs, they'll go straight to the airport. They'll go straight to Incheon Airport, and they'll be transported to the US or Canada. And so this was actually a Korean influencer. She's a singer that we got involved. So we always want these to be locally led, locally driven. So it's our HSI Korea team that is on the ground. They are the ones that are doing the helping to facilitate these. However, we need more hands on deck, so we bring in our international team to help with the handling. The dogs that are not old enough, because again, a lot of these dogs are pregnant. It is a breeding facility, so that poses some special considerations, and so we often will end up quickly with many more dogs because they're all giving birth in between the vaccination trip and the time that we are actually loading them to fly. So they go into boarding until they are 6 months of age and they're eligible for US or Canadian import. And this is what the farm looks like now. So this was taken in July, so nice and sunny, and they have completely demolished all of the cages, and that is part of the agreement, and they have transitioned to like a garden cabbage cultivation operation. So why international rehoming? I already mentioned this a little bit. We would love to rehome these dogs locally. There's just not a lot of room and capacity in Korean shelters to take these types of dogs, and we just know that we can better showcase these dogs internationally, and it also gets really good media as well. So there's indirect benefits to international rehoming. And so to date, we've rehomed now 2,700 plus dogs, which is pretty incredible, spanning 18 farms. So, thank you. But that's not all we do. Like, of course, the farm closures is what people kind of know HSI for, but we're doing a lot of work behind the scenes to generate public momentum within Korea. So we also launched a Survivor of the Dog Meat Trade, like portrait exhibition. So again, we want to show that these are not just meat dogs, these are amazing companions. And so these were all dogs from our previous farm closures that flew to North America. And artist and photographer Sophie Gamond, she's very famous for her Pitbull Flower Power campaign that was really big in North America a few years back. She did kind of this collar campaign where she created beautiful artwork and photography with the dogs, kind of with these fancy collars demonstrating like their lives as companions. And we had space this is a very busy metropolitan Seoul train station where we did a big art exhibit. And we had thousands of visitors, members of the government, the National Assembly that came by, a lot of advertisements as well. So this is another one of our rescued little guys dressed up in his little collar. And it gets great media, great in-country media, and that's what we're about, right? Like really reaching hearts and minds, changing public attitude, and gathering public support and public consensus against the meat trade. I think what's amazing is if you did go to Korea 10, 15 years ago, people were not out in the streets protesting this. Like a lot of people didn't even know, or they defended it as Korean heritage, Korean culture. And I think as this campaign and just as momentum has gained steam, now you'll see protests all the time in downtown Seoul and people that are out there with signs and billboards, and it's just really taken off with incredible momentum. So yeah, the farm closures are important, like rescuing the dogs is important, but it's really about generating that momentum. So we've seen changing attitudes, so we do invest heavily in market research. Every year we do public opinion polling to see where we're at in terms of what the attitudes are. And we've seen, again, back in 2017, 35% of people thought, yeah, dog meat trade should be banned. Now we're at almost 60% of people. We know that the vast majority of Koreans are not eating dog meat. They don't plan to eat dog meat. We're actually seeing now that kind of dog meat stew that I mentioned that's very common during the bulk days of the summer. That's actually now, dog meat is now the 6th most popular dish, where it used to be 1 or 2, and it's actually 6, and the one above that is pizza. So that's really cool. So we're seeing it fall out of favor, and we're seeing, again, a real growing momentum in terms of pet owners and the love that people have for their pets. So all that is well and good, right? Yep, we're doing the thing, we're rescuing the dogs, but like what is happening at the political level, because this is what matters. And I think we are starting to transition a little bit away from the direct action and the direct rescue, because the momentum's there. Like it accomplished that. Like it accomplished what we wanted it to accomplish, but now we need to get bills introduced to really outlaw this for good. And so we've seen all of these actions where the government has been closing these markets, they're recognizing there's public health risk. We've been seeing some amendments to the animal protection law. And then in 2021, we see President Moon, who was a huge animal lover, not president anymore, but really comes out and says, like, it is the time that we take this serious and that we outlaw this for once and for all. We saw, really exciting, the end of 2021, an actual task force created by the Korean national government of all different ministries, that, for the Ministry of Ag, Ministry of Health, to say, we need to find out, is there public consensus, because this is clearly an issue that we need to address. And so we were really building, and it's one of the reasons we did the Sophie Gaman portrait exhibit. We wanted to really show that, yes, there is public consensus within Korea against this trade. We saw the presidential elections in 2022, and every single major presidential candidate had dog meat opinion in their platform, and they were all against it, like literally every single one of them. So it just shows like how this has moved into mainstream like political dialogue. We saw the First Lady, the new First Lady, speak out against the dog meat trade publicly. That made big news in Korea. And then we've seen Seoul kind of actually thinking about Seoul government declaring a full-on ban on dog meat trade. So last slide, what is really exciting, so we've kind of switched gears a little bit. We're still going to be on the ground helping to rescue dogs as needed, but we really want to have, again, this political change. And so we've actually we've drafted and submitted with Congresswoman Han a bill to ban the dog meat trade and phase it out over a 5-year period. But not only that, that's one bill. There's been 3 additional bills introduced in the last 6 months by both the ruling and the opposition parties that are currently sitting for the National Assembly consideration. And we saw recently in August a big group of lawmakers, dozens of lawmakers, come together to actually announce that they're looking at a resolution to endorse a dog meat ban. So like the time is coming. It's just kind of a matter of when, and we have to really consider what our role is, because there's a whole lot of dogs sitting on farms, and so, well, we're not going to be rescuing them all. Like we're also having that internal conversation of what that looks like. But really exciting times. If you have any questions, Lola Weber is certainly the expert on this, but I'd also be happy to take any quick questions as well too. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Katherine. And now we will open the Q&A session. Are there any questions for Dr. Katherine? All right.
Can I ask, you mentioned that once you close the farm, the dogs are flown to other countries. At what point does the medical and behavioural assessment come into place? I imagine some of them will be.
Yeah, that's a great question. So kind of the process is they need to meet certain like requirements to be exported. So during the initial kind of what we call the vaccination trip, all the dogs are vaccinated for DHPP, so distemper parvo, rabies, and canine influenza. They're also all tested for influenza because that is an issue. So we don't do behavioral evals on the farm just because it is so high stress, like you wouldn't get accurate information. And so that's why generally the dogs do go historically from farm into a transport crate to the airport and then they're gone. And so we have in Canada, I didn't really mention this, but in Canada and in the US, we have like temporary facilities that are HSI run that have behavior teams and medical teams. So then once the dogs arrive, then they get full kind of behavioral evals and they're set up on a pathway for rehabilitation. And then we don't do direct adoptions out. We work with local partners. So then once we feel like the dogs are medically and behaviorally ready to go, then we work with local partners and they select which ones they can adopt out. So that's kind of how that works.
I think you mentioned you're estimating about 1 million dogs in South Korea, and if this is going to be the case and you're successful with all the farms closing down, does that mean 1 million dogs potentially exported to the US and Canada?
I think no. I would say no to that immediately. Also, because it's not a sustainable model, right? Like flights are insanely expensive. I mean, I think globally, probably everyone knows that. Just booking a flight here, but like particularly cargo, post-COVID. So no, we will not look to be doing these massive, large-scale shipments. But what I think is we can look to other industries that have phased out. Particularly like the fur industry is a good example in many countries, even European countries. Like it doesn't phase out overnight. Like that's the reality. Even though we would love for all of these farms to close, this will be a long, probably phase-out period. We put 5 years, other bills have 7, some have 9 years, and so I think it's going to be a gradual decline. I think the real question that is circulating now in Korea is farmers are saying, well, how much do I get? What do I get? What's my buyout? And I do think there is going to be a subsidy program to compensate, and I think the government has to take that seriously and think of what are we willing to compensate farmers. But I think that's also feeding into why all these farmers, they're seeing all these bills, like they're seeing all this national attention. They're like, I'm ready to get out because if I can get something now, I'll take it.
It's really great that obviously public sort of support for this is increasing over the years. I was really intrigued, what are the sort of main motivations, like what's changing? Is it like changes in awareness of like public health? Is it empathy? Like what do you think the main sort of motivator for change there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It is something that we try to build into our public opinion polling. Like, do you think dogs deserve protection? Do you think dogs belong in homes? And I do think we have been seeing those metrics tick up and that all dogs do deserve protection and that there's not a difference between dog meat trade dogs and my own dog. I would say, though, that like if I took a step back and looked at it more holistically, I think just growing pet ownership and just growing role, because even like pets in homes, it's not like a really long-standing phenomenon. Like I think that's really growing. That movement is growing in Korea for a multitude of reasons. And so I think it's just more kind of this growing sentiment about animal welfare that's becoming more in like the public consciousness that is driving, again, this like social change, particularly among young people that are like putting pressure on those that are involved. So I think there's a couple dimensions there, but I think that's probably the underlying reason. And I think it's been exposed more, too. I think, again, like 10 years ago, people just didn't even know that this really happened, and it's just gotten so much media exposure.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Katherine. We will now move on to the next.